My father's voice cut through the dinner conversation like a knife through warm butter. "Still renting, Olivia?" he said, loud enough that everyone at the Thanksgiving table stopped mid-chew. 23 people. 23 witnesses to what he was about to do. He didn't wait for my answer because he never did. "Your sister owns 4 properties. You're 36 years old and you have absolutely nothing to show for it. Frankly, it's embarrassing." I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, but I kept my expression blank. My mother, Patricia, nodded slowly as she passed the gravy boat to my Aunt Linda. My younger sister, Melissa, smiled into her wineglass, that small, satisfied smile I'd seen 1,000 times before. Her husband, Derek, just stared down at his plate like he wanted to disappear into the mashed potatoes. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just reached into my pocket and placed my phone face down on the polished oak table. When my father picked it up 3 minutes later, the color drained from his face so fast I thought he might actually pass out right there in front of God and everybody. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what he saw on that screen, I want you to do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to take a turn that nobody at that table saw coming, least of all my father. And drop a comment telling me where you're from and whether you've ever been underestimated by your own family. I read every single comment, and honestly, your stories keep me going. Now let me take you back to where this all started, because you need to understand exactly how my father ended up paying rent to the daughter he spent 4 decades treating like a failure. Denver, Colorado is a beautiful city. We live in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, where the air is thin and the sunsets paint the sky in colors that don't seem real. But the real altitude sickness in Denver doesn't come from the elevation. It comes from the culture. Real estate here isn't just a market. It's a blood sport. People don't measure your worth by your character or your kindness or the contributions you make to your community. They measure it by your zip code, your square footage, and whether you have granite or quartz countertops. My name is Olivia Mitchell. I'm a certified public accountant. I drive a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door and a check engine light that's been on since 2019. I buy my clothes at Target. I meal prep on Sundays. I am, by every visible measure, exactly what my father thinks I am: unremarkable, unambitious, a disappointment. Then there's Melissa. My sister is 3 years younger than me, and she plays the Denver real estate game like a professional poker player, going all in on every hand. She wears designer athleisure to the grocery store. She spends her weekends at mountain resorts in Aspen and Vail. She talks about her property portfolio to anyone who will listen, and many people who won't. In the Mitchell household, the hierarchy was established when we were children, and it never wavered. Melissa was the investment, the chosen one, the daughter worth cultivating. I was background noise. Growing up, if I brought home a report card with straight A's, my father would glance at it for maybe 3 seconds and tell me I needed to work on my leadership skills. When Melissa scraped by with C's and 1D in chemistry, my parents threw money at expensive tutors and praised her creative free spirit. When we became adults, the disparity only got worse. Melissa demanded the spotlight, and my parents happily constructed the stage, complete with professional lighting and a sound system. They bragged about her business acumen at their country club. I sat in my small apartment running tax returns for my clients, paying my own bills, keeping my mouth shut. People mistake quiet for empty. They assume that because you're not broadcasting your accomplishments on social media, you don't have anything worth broadcasting. But quiet people are watching. We're calculating. We're building in places where interference can't reach us. My father believed his arrogance was armor. He thought his corporate title and his sprawling house in Cherry Hills made him untouchable. He assumed my silence meant I'd accepted my place at the bottom of his hierarchy. What he didn't know was that while he was draining his home equity to fund Melissa's disasters, I was constructing something he couldn't see. A fortress built on clean numbers, fixed-rate mortgages, and the kind of patience that only comes from being ignored your entire life. That cramped apartment my parents rent today holds a secret that's about to demolish everything my father thought he knew about success and failure. But the foundation of that secret was poured 14 years ago on a rainy October night, when I finally understood that sharing my life with this family was like mailing letters to a house that had already burned to the ground. I was 22 years old the first time I understood my exact value in the Mitchell family economy. I just started working at a mid-sized accounting firm in the Denver Tech Center, auditing books for dental practices and small medical supply companies. I brought my lunch in reusable containers because every dollar mattered. I drove a used sedan that my father openly mocked, calling it a poverty mobile at Sunday dinners. Every spare cent I earned went into a high-yield savings account at a credit union that offered better rates than the big banks. In Denver, saving money feels like trying to outrun a freight train. Housing prices climb while you sleep. The goalposts move every quarter. But I found a loophole in the system, and that loophole was Aurora. Aurora, Colorado lacks the prestige of Cherry Hills or Washington Park. It doesn't have the trendy restaurants of Lohi or the boutique shops of Old South Gaylord. But the math worked, and numbers don't lie. I secured an FHA loan with 3.5% down and bought a duplex on a quiet street that nobody from my family would ever voluntarily visit. The property was tired, the siding was peeling, the gutters sagged, the interior smelled like cigarette smoke and wet carpet. I didn't care. It was mine. For 8 months, I sacrificed every weekend to that building. I wore paint-stained overalls and work boots with steel toes. I watched YouTube tutorials at midnight to learn how to patch drywall, snake drain lines, and install laminate flooring. My knuckles were constantly scraped. My lower back ached every morning. I spent Friday nights breathing in joint compound dust and primer fumes, sleeping on an air mattress in the unfinished living room. I was building equity with my own 2 hands. I was converting a liability into an asset, one 2x4 out of. I thought this was the key. Real estate was the ultimate currency in my family. My father judged everyone by their property holdings and the view from their back patio. I genuinely believed that entering his arena would force him to see me as something other than a disappointment. I believed that holding a deed would serve as undeniable proof that I deserved a seat at his table. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. I prepared my announcement carefully. I scrubbed the dried paint from under my fingernails. I put on a clean sweater and drove to my parents' house for Sunday dinner, carrying the pride of new ownership like a shield. The dining room smelled like roasted lamb and a Napa Valley Cabernet that cost more than my grocery budget for a month. My father sat at the head of the table, cutting his meat with surgical precision. Melissa sat across from me, 20 years old, fresh out of a communications program at CU Boulder, already complaining about the starter condo our parents were subsidizing for her in Capitol Hill. I waited for a pause in the conversation. When my father stopped talking long enough to refill his wine glass, I cleared my throat. "I bought a property," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A duplex in Aurora. I closed on it last Tuesday." I waited for the shift. I waited for the nod of acknowledgement, the follow-up questions about interest rates or cap rates or my plans for the second unit. I waited for my father to recognize me as someone worth noticing. My father set his wine glass down slowly. He didn't look at me. He looked at his plate. "A duplex," he said, letting the word sit in the air like something rotten. "In Aurora," I nodded. "I'm living in one side and fixing up the other to rent. The numbers make sense. I ran the projections 3 times. My father finally raised his eyes, and the look he gave me contained absolutely no warmth. "A duplex is for people who can't afford real property, Olivia. It's a stepping stone for the desperate. You're putting a Band-Aid on a bad decision and calling it an investment." Melissa actually laughed out loud, then tried to hide it behind her napkin. I felt heat spreading across my chest, but I kept my spine straight. "I own it," I said quietly. "I saved the down payment myself. Nobody helped me." My mother placed her fork down gently and offered one of her trademark patronizing sighs. "Olivia, your father is just being realistic," she said in that soft voice that always preceded something cruel. "Real estate is complicated. In fact, we were just discussing Melissa's future investments. If you had that kind of money saved, you really should have consulted us first. You could have contributed to Melissa's next purchase. She's looking at properties in Highlands Ranch, and a little extra capital would help her negotiate better terms. I stared at my mother. She was serious. She genuinely believed I should have handed my savings over to my sister. The room went quiet except for the sound of my father chewing. "You need to be realistic about your limitations," he said finally. "Not everyone has the vision required for serious real estate investment. Maybe you should stick to what you're good at, running numbers for other people." The rest of that dinner is mostly a blur. I remember nodding. I remember clearing plates. I remember thanking my mother for the meal. I remember driving back to Aurora in a rainstorm so heavy I could barely see the highway lines. I parked in the cracked driveway of my duplex. The rain pounded against the roof of my car, deafening and relentless. I gripped the steering wheel until my hands went numb, and I cried. But I wasn't crying out of sadness, I was crying from clarity. Ice-cold, diamond-hard clarity. The illusion shattered that night. I saw my family for exactly what they were. A system designed to extract my value and redirect it toward Melissa's ego. My father would never respect me. My mother would never protect me. Any success I achieved would either be minimized until it vanished or confiscated to serve the golden child. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The tears stopped. A cold, heavy resolve settled into my chest, replacing the desperate daughter who had driven to that house an hour earlier. I made a silent vow in the front seat of that car. I would never tell them anything ever again. I would never share my victories or my struggles. I would become invisible in their narrative, operating entirely in the shadows where their judgment couldn't reach. I would build my empire in complete silence, and I would never, ever give them another opportunity to make me feel small. That night in the rain, I stopped mailing letters to a house that had burned down. I stopped seeking approval from people who had already decided I was worthless. I went inside my tired, smelly duplex, opened my laptop, and began charting a new course. If my father valued real estate above all else, I would master his world. I just wouldn't let him see me do it. The foundation of his destruction was poured that night, and he had no idea the countdown had already started. The next morning, still angry, still hurt, still determined, I filed the paperwork. Redwood Property Holdings LLC was born on a Wednesday morning in November. The name was intentionally forgettable, a bland corporate designation that revealed nothing and blended into the background noise of Colorado's business registries. I paid the state filing fee, received my articles of organization, and officially split my existence into two parallel realities. By day, I remained the dependable, unremarkable accountant. I scrutinized balance sheets for medical clinics and small manufacturing firms. I wore neutral cardigans, kept my desk immaculately organized, and blended into the beige cubicle walls. My colleagues saw a quiet professional who brought her lunch and rarely took vacation days. They never suspected what I was building after the sun went down. My nights belonged exclusively to the numbers. The blue glow of spreadsheets became my closest companion. At 2 a.m, I analyzed rental comps across the Denver metro area. The city was transforming before my eyes, becoming a magnet for California transplants and tech companies flush with venture capital. Neighborhoods that had been working-class strongholds were gentrifying rapidly, pushing prices higher every single month. Most people saw a housing crisis and wrung their hands about affordability. I saw a mathematical puzzle waiting to be solved, and I had one critical advantage over the out-of-state investors. I lived here. I knew how to read the hidden distress signals in a property listing. I hunted for off-market deals, targeting exhausted landlords who wanted quick exits and didn't want to deal with showings and open houses. I ignored the flashy turnkey properties. The duplex in Aurora performed exactly as my projections predicted. The rental income from the second unit covered the mortgage, property taxes, insurance, and still generated a small monthly surplus. I lived in my half and funneled every spare dollar into reserves. I ate rice and beans. I fixed my own car using YouTube videos and socket wrenches from Harbor Freight. I wore the same winter boots until the soles separated and snow soaked through to my socks. 20 months later, I leveraged the rising equity in that duplex to acquire a tired fourplex in Lakewood. The building had peeling exterior paint, outdated electrical panels, and a backyard choked with weeds that stood waist high. I spent my holidays rewiring light fixtures, laying cheap but durable vinyl plank flooring, and repainting every single interior wall in neutral colors that photographed well. I realized very quickly that visibility was dangerous. If my family discovered my growing portfolio, the demands would start immediately. My father would insist on helping me manage the assets, asserting his unearned authority and trying to take credit for my work. My mother would suggest I let Melissa live in one of the units rent-free to help her save money for her own investments. They would view my capital as a family resource meant to subsidize the chosen child. To prevent that nightmare, I built a firewall between my properties and my identity. I hired Summit Property Management, a local firm that handles everything from tenant screening to midnight maintenance calls. All communication flowed through their generic office number. My name appeared nowhere on the properties. No mailbox bore my name. No tenant ever met my face. I became a phantom landlord, operating entirely through the corporate veil of Redwood Holdings. If a water heater failed, the tenant called Summit. If a toilet overflowed at 3 a.m, Summit dispatched the plumber. If someone wanted to complain about parking or noise, they filed a ticket through an online portal that I reviewed from my laptop while eating dinner alone at my kitchen table. The contrast between my hidden reality and my family's perception of me provided a strange, intoxicating comfort. Sunday dinners remained mandatory in the Mitchell household, and I attended them faithfully, playing my assigned role with method actor precision. My father would sit at the head of his custom walnut table, swirling expensive Pinot Noir, and ask condescending questions about my career trajectory. Was the accounting firm planning to promote me? Had I considered going back to school for an MBA? Shouldn't I be thinking about buying something, anything, to start building equity? I would offer vague, non-committal responses designed to bore him into changing the subject. Then the spotlight would shift to Melissa, and she would lean forward, jewelry glinting, and launch into another performance about her theoretical business ventures. One month, she was launching a boutique consulting firm for small businesses. The next month, she was rebranding herself as a lifestyle influencer focused on luxury mountain living. My father devoured every empty word. He told his golf buddies that Melissa possessed the rare Mitchell instinct for entrepreneurship. He praised her vision and her courage, while conveniently ignoring the fact that she had never, not once, generated a single profitable quarter in her entire adult life. I would sit quietly at the far end of the table, cutting my overcooked vegetables, and my phone would vibrate silently in my pocket. A push notification from the Summit Management portal: rent cleared, maintenance complete, cash flow positive. Another month of revenue quietly adding to my fortress. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. My parents worshipped the illusion of wealth while actively scorning the daughter who actually possessed it. They threw their money and their praise at a mirage while dismissing the person who had built something real. I used their contempt as fuel. When the fourplex in Lakewood stabilized and started generating consistent returns, I executed a cash-out refinance and acquired an 8-unit brick building in Littleton. The portfolio grew steadily, not through luck or family handouts, but through relentless, unglamorous discipline. The Denver market surged upward, and my properties appreciated in tandem. The snowball effect took hold. Rental income from 16 units easily funded the down payment for my next acquisition. Over the following decade, I added 20 more doors, 36 units in total, scattered across 6 different properties in neighborhoods ranging from Inglewood to Westminster. The original properties were entirely paid off, completely free of debt. The cash flow was a river, wide and deep and relentlessly dependable. I wasn't just accumulating brick and mortar. I was constructing layers of protection. Every signed deed added another level of insulation between my peace of mind and their brutal judgment. Every cleared rent check raised the walls of my fortress higher and thicker. When my father made another dismissive comment about my lack of ambition, it no longer landed the way it once did. His words hit the fortress walls and fell uselessly to the ground. I possessed an unshakable psychological armor because I knew something he didn't. My net worth dwarfed his, but the money itself was secondary. The real victory was the autonomy. I answered to no one. I owed them nothing. I had built a moat so wide that their opinions could never reach the island where I actually lived. But a fortress is only truly tested when a real threat appears on the horizon. While I spent 14 years building my foundation on bedrock, Melissa was busy constructing a monument to her own vanity out of tissue paper and desperation. She craved the appearance of real estate success, but she lacked the discipline to sustain the reality. She wanted the title of property mogul without the scraped knuckles or the late-night spreadsheet sessions. And my father, blinded by favoritism and his obsessive need to project a legacy, was about to hand her the gasoline and matches that would burn her fake empire to the ground. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I need you to do something for me. If this story is hitting close to home, if you've ever been the underestimated one in your family, I want you to subscribe to this channel right now. We're building a community of people who understand that the best revenge isn't loud. It's mathematical, it's patient, and it's absolutely devastating when it finally arrives. Drop a comment and tell me about a time someone underestimated you. What did you do about it? Did you prove them wrong, or did you just quietly build something they couldn't see? I'm reading every comment because your stories matter. Now let me tell you about the beginning of the end for the Mitchell family empire that never actually existed. While I was analyzing cap rates in silence and adding properties to my portfolio, one careful acquisition at a time, my sister was erecting a monument to her own ego. You learn a lot about a family by watching what they choose to celebrate. My family didn't celebrate substance or quiet discipline or sustainable growth. They celebrated performance. The appearance of wealth mattered more than wealth itself. Melissa turned 26 the same year I closed on my 19th rental unit. I spent that weekend replacing corroded pipes in a garden-level apartment, wearing rubber gloves up to my elbows, and learning more than I ever wanted to know about PVC cement. Melissa spent that weekend accepting the keys to a kingdom she hadn't earned. My father hosted an elaborate dinner at his country club to mark the occasion. He stood at the head of a table, decorated with imported flowers that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and he raised a glass of champagne that cost $50 a bottle. He announced to everyone within earshot that he had pulled $175,000 in equity from his home to provide Melissa with seed capital. He called it an investment in a winner. My mother actually cried, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed linen napkin, overwhelmed by her husband's generosity and vision. I sat near the kitchen doors, chewing overcooked chicken, calculating the interest my father would be paying on that borrowed equity for the next 30 years. Melissa didn't use those funds to build a sustainable business model. She used them to buy a sprawling contemporary farmhouse in Cherry Creek, one of Denver's most expensive neighborhoods. The property featured vaulted ceilings, waterfall quartz countertops, and a striking black and white exterior that photographed beautifully for social media. It was a gorgeous house designed for entertaining and impressing dinner guests. It was not designed to generate cash flow, but Melissa didn't just want to own a primary residence. She wanted the identity of a real estate investor, and she wanted it immediately, without the decade of sacrifice required to build it properly. She took out high-interest lines of credit against the farmhouse, leveraging herself to the breaking point, and acquired 2 more properties specifically for short-term rentals. She financed these purchases using adjustable-rate mortgages. Anyone with even a basic understanding of economics knows that an arm in a volatile market is a ticking time bomb. You're gambling that interest rates will stay low forever, betting your financial future on the assumption that conditions will remain permanently favorable. It's financial Russian roulette, and Melissa was spinning the chamber with both hands. She didn't understand the risk because she'd never had to understand risk. Every safety net in her life had been purchased by our father. Immediately after acquiring these properties, Melissa launched a comprehensive social media campaign. My daily routine involved answering emails from contractors and reviewing invoices for water heater replacements. Melissa's routine involved staging her properties with expensive mid-century modern furniture and posting carefully filtered photographs of herself holding oversized key rings. She shared images of champagne brunches on her farmhouse patio, She used hashtags like self-made and boss babe and property investor. Her carefully curated digital presence painted a picture of effortless success. My father shared every single post. He bragged to his golf partners about his youngest daughter's natural instinct for the market. My mother printed out screenshots of Melissa's Instagram feed and pinned them to the refrigerator like elementary school art projects. There's a particular tragedy in watching people worship a facade. The exterior was glittering and flawless, but there was no foundation underneath. It was all lighting and angles, and the only person who seemed to understand the precarious math was Melissa's husband, Derek. Derek worked as a commercial loan underwriter for a regional bank. He spent 40 hours a week evaluating risk, analyzing debt-to-income ratios, and rejecting applications from people who were over-leveraged. He knew exactly how to read a balance sheet, and he knew the carrying costs on Melissa's properties were unsustainable. I watched Derek change over the months following Melissa's expansion. At Sunday dinners, he used to be engaging and funny, telling stories about college or discussing Broncos games with easy enthusiasm. After Melissa bought the short-term rentals, his demeanor shifted. He stopped participating in conversations. He started pouring his whiskey heavier the moment he walked through my parents' front door. I would sit across from him and watch him stare at the grain in the table, looking like a man standing on train tracks listening to a distant whistle growing louder. When my father would launch into his weekly praise of Melissa's aggressive expansion strategy, Derek would grip his glass until his knuckles went white, but he never contradicted the narrative. He never pointed out that their vacancy rates were destroying their margins. He just drank his whiskey and swallowed his panic, knowing their lifestyle was entirely dependent on a fragile balance that could shatter the moment interest rates ticked upward. The irony of these family dinners was suffocating. My father would finish praising Melissa, then turn his attention to me with that familiar expression of disappointment. He would look at my unbranded sweater and my bare wrist and offer unsolicited financial advice. I needed to take more risks. I needed to be bolder. Saving pennies at an accounting firm would never build real wealth. I needed to show some initiative, be more like my sister, stop playing it safe. I sat there absorbing his condescension while my phone vibrated silently with notifications. Another month closed, another work order completed, another deposit clearing. I owned properties that generated more positive monthly cash flow than Melissa would see in an entire year. But, in my father's eyes, I remained a cautionary tale about wasted potential. I didn't defend myself. Correcting him would have required revealing my portfolio, and the moment I did that, the demands would start, the requests for loans, the expectation that I'd house Melissa in one of my units for free, the insistence that family takes care of family, which in the Mitchell household only ever flowed in one direction. I preferred to remain the disappointment because being a disappointment meant nobody expected anything from me. Nobody asked for favors. Nobody demanded explanations. I was free to operate in complete obscurity, which was exactly where I wanted to be. The cracks in Melissa's empire started showing late the following year. She began complaining about the hidden costs of property ownership. She mentioned casually at dinner that a furnace replacement at one of her short-term rentals had completely wiped out her operating budget for the quarter. She framed it as a minor annoyance, just part of being a busy investor. But I saw Derek close his eyes when she said it. I saw the muscle in his jaw flex. He knew they didn't have reserves to absorb another major expense. Then came the whispered conversations. I walked into my parents' kitchen one evening to refill my water glass and caught Melissa speaking to my father in urgent, hushed tones. She was asking for a short-term loan to cover a gap in one of her mortgage payments. She promised to pay him back the moment her holiday bookings came through. My father handed over the money without hesitation, desperate to keep his star player in the game. He didn't realize he was throwing good money after bad. He didn't understand the tide was already shifting and the water was rising faster than anyone could bail. The tension in the Mitchell family ecosystem grew thick and oppressive. You could feel it in the way my mother paced the kitchen. You could see it in the way Derek avoided eye contact with everyone. They were all trapped in a shared delusion, terrified to admit the math was failing. I maintained my quiet distance, watching the numbers tick upward on my own ledgers. I knew the breaking point was inevitable. An empire built on borrowed money and parental favoritism cannot withstand a genuine economic shift. I just had to wait for the storm to arrive, and I could already see the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. But the real earthquake wasn't Melissa's collapse. The real earthquake was about to hit my father personally. And it would leave him completely vulnerable, just in time for the most ironic Thanksgiving dinner in Mitchell family history. Let me tell you about the day the corporate warrior lost his armor and discovered what it actually feels like to need shelter you can't afford. My father built his entire identity around being a senior logistics executive at a regional supply chain firm. He wore his title like other men wear military medals. He demanded respect based on his corner office and his company expense account. He operated under the absolute conviction that his value to the company was permanent and unquestionable. He was 60 years old when the board of directors decided to restructure the executive tier. They called it early retirement. They framed it as an opportunity for him to enjoy his golden years and spend more time with family. My father knew the truth. They were pushing him out to replace him with a younger vice president who would accept half his salary and work twice as hard to prove herself. The severance package they offered was insultingly small. It provided enough money to maintain appearances for maybe 6 months, but it was nowhere near sufficient to sustain the lifestyle he and my mother had built over 3 decades. I received the news during a Sunday dinner. My father sat at the head of the table, swirling scotch instead of his usual wine, staring at the chandelier he'd purchased to impress dinner guests. He announced he had decided to step away from the corporate grind to focus on managing his investments and enjoying a simpler life. He delivered the lie with such conviction I almost believed he'd convinced himself. But I'm an accountant. I have a natural instinct for detecting financial distress underneath polished presentations. I noticed the changes in their household over the following weeks. The landscaping service stopped coming. The lawn grew shaggy. My mother started buying generic brands at the grocery store. My father canceled his country club membership, claiming the crowds had gotten annoying and the course wasn't being maintained properly. The facade was cracking and the foundation underneath was crumbling. The primary source of the structural damage was the $175,000 my father had extracted from his home equity to fund Melissa's disaster. He'd burdened his primary residence with a second mortgage, assuming his executive salary would easily cover the monthly payments until he hit retirement age with full benefits. Now, stripped of his income 3 years early, that debt became an anchor pulling him underwater. The beautiful house in Cherry Hills, the symbol of Mitchell family success, was suddenly unaffordable. My father tried to navigate the crisis in private. He met with financial advisors. He explored debt consolidation loans. He even considered pulling from his retirement accounts early and accepting the tax penalties. Every path led to the same mathematically inevitable conclusion. He couldn't service the debt. The only viable option was liquidating the asset. I watched my father endure the profound humiliation of listing his house for sale. He hired a premium real estate agent and instructed her to price the property aggressively. He told everyone in his social circle that he and my mother were choosing to downsize, spinning a narrative about wanting less maintenance and more freedom to travel. He maintained his arrogant posture, pretending this was a strategic choice rather than a forced surrender to his own financial mismanagement. But the Denver luxury market is a ruthless judge of value. High-end properties were sitting longer. Buyers were getting pickier, demanding concessions and inspection repairs. The house sat on the market for weeks. The initial listing price got slashed, then it got slashed again. My father's daily routine devolved into pacing the hardwood floors and glaring at the for sale sign planted in his immaculate front lawn like a flag of defeat. My mother packed decades of accumulated possessions into cardboard boxes, wrapping her fine china in newspaper, smiling tightly when neighbors asked where they were moving. She refused to acknowledge the fear radiating from her husband. The most striking element of this collapse was their absolute refusal to ask me for help. I possessed the liquid capital to pay off their second mortgage entirely. I could have stabilized their situation with a single wire transfer. I never offered, and they never asked. Seeking financial rescue from the daughter they'd labeled worthless would require admitting their entire worldview was wrong. It would mean acknowledging that the unremarkable accountant possessed more financial wisdom than the logistics executive and the golden child combined. Their pride was worth more to them than their house. When the property finally sold, the proceeds barely covered both mortgages and closing costs. My father walked away from 30 years of homeownership with a fraction of the equity he'd assumed was guaranteed. He was forced to enter the rental market, a market he had openly mocked for his entire adult life. The search for a suitable apartment was degrading for a man with his ego. My father hadn't filled out a rental application since his 20s. He was appalled by the invasive process. Property management companies demanded proof of income, bank statements, credit reports, employment verification. He was subjected to background checks and forced to justify his financial viability to leasing agents half his age. I observed this struggle from a careful distance. I understood the Denver rental market intimately because I controlled a meaningful piece of it. I knew exactly how difficult it was to secure a luxury unit without verifiable employment income. My father and mother toured dozens of apartments. They rejected options because the countertops were laminate instead of quartz, or the parking situation wasn't ideal for their remaining luxury sedan, or the building didn't have the right aesthetic. They were searching for a property that offered the prestige of their former estate without the corresponding price tag. The irony was exquisite and almost too perfect. The man who had humiliated me at a dining table for buying a duplex in Aurora was now desperately refreshing rental listing websites at midnight, searching for a landlord willing to accept a retired executive with dwindling reserves. He was experiencing the vulnerability he'd always believed he was immune to, and I watched it unfold with clinical detachment. Then one Tuesday afternoon in late October, a rental application landed in my email queue, routed through Summit Property Management's screening system. The property in question was one of my recent acquisitions, a beautifully renovated building in downtown Denver featuring exposed brick, high ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows. The unit was a premium two-bedroom with custom cabinetry and stainless steel appliances. Monthly rent was $2,800. I opened the application file, and my heart stopped. Applicant names: Gregory Mitchell and Patricia Mitchell. I stared at the screen, reading the names over and over, making absolutely sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. I scrolled down through the supporting documentation. There was my father's identity, laid bare in PDF format, his diminished retirement income, his bank statements showing the deposits from the forced home sale, his credit report, bruised and battered from the debt shuffling he'd done trying to keep Melissa's properties afloat. The math was razor thin. He barely met the income requirements, and only because he was willing to stretch his fixed income to the absolute breaking point. He couldn't afford this apartment, not really, but he needed the address. He needed a downtown location that would let him maintain the illusion of success when he ran into former colleagues at restaurants. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of my refrigerator, holding my father's financial desperation in the palm of my hand. I could reject the application. I could have Summit fabricate a generic reason about insufficient income history, forcing my parents to search for something cheaper in a neighborhood that would wound my father's ego daily. I could approve it and offer a family discount, secretly subsidizing his failure the way he'd subsidized Melissa's. Or I could pick up my phone, call him directly, and listen to the silence when I informed him his disappointing daughter was the landlord reviewing his application. I chose none of those options. Revenge is noisy. Revenge requires an audience and explanations and justifications. What I wanted was simpler and colder. I wanted insulation. I wanted to live my life completely free from their judgment, and that required mathematical neutrality. I moved my cursor and clicked approve. No discount, no special terms, no modifications to the standard lease agreement. He would pay market rate like every other tenant in my portfolio because that's what he was now. Just another signature on a legally binding contract. the automated system took over. Summit Property Management generated the standard welcome email. A leasing agent named Monica, who had never met me and only knew Redwood Holdings as a corporate account number, facilitated the signing. My father signed a 12-month lease. He handed over a cashier's check for first month's rent, plus a hefty security deposit. He received a digital access code and a generic move-in information packet. He believed he was renting from a faceless corporation. He had no idea the corporate veil was woven entirely from his own daughter's silent endurance. The first of the month arrived. The rent portal updated. An electronic transfer moved from my father's account to Summit's operating account. Summit deducted their management fee and forwarded the remainder to Redwood Holdings. The money appeared in my business checking account. I watched the numbers update on my laptop screen while eating leftover stir-fry at my kitchen table. The capital he'd refused to invest in my education, the resources he'd diverted entirely to Melissa, were now returning to me in the form of a contractual obligation he was legally required to fulfill. Every 30 days, my father paid for the privilege of shelter, and those funds financed the continued expansion of an empire he didn't know existed. I had told him once, years ago, that I owned a duplex. He'd called it a stepping stone for desperate people. Now he was paying rent to the owner of 36 units, and he had no idea. The cognitive dissonance should have been unbearable, but I felt nothing except a clean, quiet peace. I didn't need his validation anymore. I owned his sanctuary. This delicate system sustained itself for months. Rent cleared like clockwork on the 1st. My father's complaints about minor building issues flowed through Summit's customer service portal. Sunday dinners continued with their predictable scripts, though now they were hosted in my apartment instead of his house. The gatherings relocated from the sprawling estate to the downtown unit, and I attended as a guest in my own property. The first time I visited after they moved in, my mother apologized nervously for the reduced square footage, gesturing at the smaller dining table they'd squeezed near the kitchen island. My father tried to reclaim his authority by criticizing the building management. The lobby door stuck when temperatures dropped. The landscaping crew arrived too early on Thursday mornings. The parking garage gate sometimes malfunctioned. I sat in a chair I technically owned, in a room where I held the deed, listening to him critique my operational efficiency. He continued treating me with casual disdain, asking if my accounting firm offered decent health insurance, then steering conversation back to Melissa. Melissa was dodging phone calls from mortgage companies by then, but my father still praised her bold vision and entrepreneurial courage. The irony was suffocating. The man attempting to belittle me was literally sitting under a roof I owned, paying me monthly to keep that roof over his head. But the system built on such a severe imbalance of truth can't remain stable forever. Pressure builds, searching for a release valve. The calendar turned toward late autumn. Denver's weather cooled, bringing sharp winds off the mountains. Thanksgiving approached, and the tension inside Unit 4B began compressing toward critical mass. Now listen, if you're still with me at this point, I need to ask you something. Have you subscribed yet? Because what happens next is the moment everything I've been building toward for 14 years finally detonates. This is the part where silence becomes louder than any words I could have ever screamed. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see how this plays out, and drop a comment telling me this. Would you have told them the truth earlier, or would you have waited just like I did? I'm genuinely curious because I've asked myself that question 1,000 times. Now let me take you to Thanksgiving dinner, where my father's pride is about to collide with reality so hard the sound will echo for years. Thanksgiving arrived with frost covering Denver, and my father's ego still somehow intact despite everything. I drove my decade-old Honda through quiet streets, a dish of sweet potato casserole riding shotgun. My destination was a modern downtown building with exposed brick and industrial windows. I pulled into visitor parking, which felt absurd since I owned the entire structure, and sat in my car for a moment looking up at the 4th floor. Behind one of those windows, my family was gathering to celebrate gratitude, though I knew gratitude wouldn't be on the menu. I walked through the lobby, noting a small scuff on the baseboards that I'd need to mention to Summit. I took the elevator to the fourth floor and stepped into a hallway that smelled like my mother's overcooked turkey and cheap pumpkin spice candles she used to mask the apartment's smaller size. I opened the door to Unit 4B and was hit by a wall of heat. My father always kept the thermostat at 76 degrees, a habit from when he could afford to burn money on utilities. Now that same temperature in a two-bedroom apartment felt like walking into a sauna. 23 extended family members were crammed into an open-concept living area designed for 4 people maximum. The real source of the claustrophobia was my father's dining table. He'd refused to sell his enormous mahogany table when they downsized, and he'd somehow wedged this massive piece of furniture into the apartment. It dominated the space, pushed against the kitchen island on one side and nearly touching the wall on the other. Aunts and uncles had to turn sideways just to reach their chairs. The physical discomfort mirrored the emotional tension perfectly. Every gesture felt restricted. Every breath felt labored. I handed my mother the casserole. She took it with a distracted smile, her hair damp from kitchen humidity, and rushed back to her overcrowded stove. I navigated through relatives, exchanging polite nods with cousins I barely knew, and claimed my usual spot at the far end of the table, the seat closest to the kitchen door, the position reserved for whoever was expected to clear plates and refill water pitchers without being asked. My father sat at the head of the table wearing a pressed shirt and his expensive watch, projecting the aura of a man still in control, despite the fact his throne room was currently leased. When a man loses tangible power, he compensates by dominating airspace. My father spoke louder than necessary, interrupting his brother-in-law mid-sentence to deliver opinions about supply chain logistics and Federal Reserve policies. He laughed at his own observations and demanded everyone's attention, trying to force reality to bend through sheer volume. Across the table sat Melissa and Derek. Melissa wore a silk blouse and perfect makeup, still performing her role as a successful investor, even though her properties were circling the drain. To a casual observer, she looked like Denver success personified. To someone who understood balance sheets, she looked like a foreclosure notice waiting to be served. Derek sat beside her looking like he hadn't slept properly in months. His skin had a grayish tint. While Melissa chattered about market trends she didn't understand, Derek stared at a knot in the wood table and drank bourbon like it was water. He was on his 3rd glass before the turkey was even carved. The meal began with chaotic clattering of silverware against china. Dishes were passed. Elbows bumped wine glasses. The oversized table made every movement awkward and precarious. My father carved the dry turkey and distributed portions. As soon as plates were full, he lifted his wine glass and tapped it with a knife. The sharp ringing sound commanded immediate silence. 23 people stopped chewing and turned toward the patriarch. He didn't offer a traditional toast about family or health or gratitude. He used the moment to validate himself through Melissa's illusion. He turned to her with unmistakable pride. "Let's raise a glass to my youngest daughter," he announced, his voice filling every corner of the cramped apartment. "Melissa is showing this family what real ambition looks like. 4 properties before her 30th birthday. She's building an empire and proving that the Mitchell instinct for investment runs deep." Melissa beamed, soaking up the praise like she was dying of thirst. Several relatives raised their glasses and murmured congratulations. Nobody looked at Derek, who closed his eyes and took another long drink. Nobody looked at my mother, who stared at her congealing gravy with a hollow expression. And absolutely nobody looked at me. I sat in my corner, chewing overcooked turkey that tasted like dust and disappointment. I felt the suffocating heat, smelled the artificial cinnamon candles, and listened to the steady ticking of a grandfather clock my father had crammed into the corner. I watched my father toast a daughter drowning in toxic debt while sitting under a roof financed by the daughter he'd always considered worthless. The pressure in the room built like a storm system gathering strength. My father lowered his glass and scanned the table, feeding on the polite smiles, feeling invincible again for a brief moment. Then he made a decision that would change everything. He needed a new target to reinforce his position, and his eyes drifted down the table until they landed on me. "This is it." This is the moment. My father looked directly at me and said the words that would destroy his entire carefully constructed reality. "Still renting, Olivia?" He said it loud enough that conversations at the other end of the table stopped completely. He didn't wait for an answer because he never did. "Your sister owns 4 properties. You're 36 years old and you have absolutely nothing to show for your life. Frankly, you're an embarrassment to this family." My mother nodded slowly, passing the gravy. Melissa smiled into her wine glass. Derek stared at his plate. 23 people sat in silence, watching the familiar script play out one more time. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out my phone, and placed it face down on the mahogany table. My father stared at it like I just laid down a loaded weapon. Minutes passed. The silence stretched. He was waiting for me to break, to cry, to storm out like I was being unreasonable. When I didn't react, when I just sat there calmly meeting his eyes, something in him snapped. He needed to regain control. He needed to punish my defiance. He reached across the table, his arm extending over the turkey and the side dishes, and he grabbed my phone. "You'll sit here and listen until I'm finished," he said, snatching the device from the table before I could respond. He intended to hold it hostage, to force my attention back to his lecture about my failures and Melissa's superiority. He expected the phone to be a silent piece of glass and metal in his hand. He was operating under the assumption it belonged to the struggling, invisible daughter he'd always believed me to be. He had no idea he was holding the detonator. As his fingers gripped the phone, the motion sensors activated. The screen woke up, bursting into bright, unforgiving light. My father had planned to just pocket the device or toss it onto the sideboard, but the sudden illumination caught his eye. He couldn't help himself. He looked down. The lock screen was still displaying an unread notification from Summit Property Management, but when he tilted the phone slightly, my thumbprint from when he'd grabbed it registered on the sensor. The security bypassed. The notification vanished, replaced instantly by the live dashboard. I have sat through brutal financial audits and hostile client meetings, but I have never seen time move the way it did in that dining room. The moment lasted exactly 9 seconds. I counted every single one. My father spent 30 years as a logistics executive analyzing freight manifests and supply chain data. He knew how to scan columns of numbers instinctively, looking for patterns and anomalies. When he looked at that screen expecting to find something he could mock, his corporate training took over. His eyes moved across the interface with practiced efficiency. The first thing he saw was the property list. Street addresses spanning the most valuable neighborhoods in Metro Denver. He saw the volume, 36 distinct units generating monthly revenue, 4 seconds. His thumb moved across the screen, scrolling without conscious thought. He was looking for the punchline, the explanation that would let him dismiss this as a mistake or a joke. He scrolled down, watching addresses blur past. Familiar zip codes. Market rate rents ranging from $1,800 to $3,000 per unit. 6 seconds. The scrolling stopped. His thumb froze. He'd reached the downtown properties, and he was staring at his own address. The building we were currently sitting in. The unit number, 4B. 8 seconds. He found the tenant column. Mitchell, Gregory, and Patricia. His eyes tracked to the adjacent payment column. $2,800. Next to that figure, a bright green status indicator. Paid. 9 seconds. Then he looked at the top of the screen, seeking the header that would explain who owned this portfolio. Owner, Redwood Property Holdings, LLC. Primary contact, Olivia Mitchell. The physiological reaction was immediate and brutal. The confident flush that had colored his cheeks during his toast drained away completely, leaving behind a sickly, grayish pallor. The prominent vein near his temple that had been throbbing with righteous authority flattened and went still. His jaw went slack. His lips parted slightly. He stopped breathing, holding air in his lungs like exhaling would make the screen's information real. He looked like a man who had stepped confidently forward and discovered the ground had vanished beneath his feet. The silence in the apartment transformed from uncomfortable to absolutely suffocating. 23 guests sat frozen, watching the patriarch turn to stone. They had braced for shouting. They'd expected him to hurl my phone across the room or deliver another crushing verbal assault. They were completely unprepared for his total shutdown. Melissa noticed first. She was deeply attuned to our father's moods, relying on his approval to fuel her delusions. She leaned forward, expecting him to unleash fury on me. When he just stood there paralyzed, confusion flickered across her face. "Dad, what are you looking at?" she demanded, her voice carrying an edge of panic. "What did she show you?" My father didn't answer. He couldn't form words. The entire architecture of his pride had just collapsed, and he was standing in the rubble without a script. He slowly lowered his arm. He set my phone back on the table with a soft double click that echoed in the silent room. It sounded like a door locking. He pulled his hand away like the device had burned him. He kept his eyes fixed on the tablecloth, refusing to look at Melissa, refusing to look at the guests, and absolutely refusing to look at me. I reached forward calmly and retrieved my phone. My movements were unhurried and deliberate. I picked it up, locked the screen, and slipped it back into my pocket. I didn't sigh, I didn't smirk. I maintained the measured breathing of someone who had spent 14 years learning to control her reactions. The relatives leaned in unconsciously, drawn by the gravity of an unexplained catastrophe. They were waiting for someone to translate the sudden collapse. I decided to help them. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the flat, clinical tone of an auditor presenting quarterly findings. "I own this building," I said. The words landed like a physical object. "I've owned it for 5 years. You've been my tenants for 8 months. You pay rent to me." I watched comprehension ripple through the room like a shockwave. Cousin Rachel froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Uncle Tom blinked rapidly, trying to reconcile the quiet accountant with the owner of a premium downtown property. They were processing the fact that they were eating Thanksgiving dinner in an apartment financed by the woman my father had spent 20 minutes degrading. Melissa reacted like a cornered animal. Her entire identity rested on being the superior sister. She required my failure to validate her success. If I owned a multi-million-dollar property, her narrative was a lie. "You're lying," she snapped, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "You don't own anything downtown. You work in a cubicle, Olivia. You drive a car from 2014. You're making this up because you're jealous." I kept my hands resting in my lap. "I'm not lying, Melissa. The management company is Summit Property Management. You can verify ownership through the county assessor's public database tomorrow if you need independent confirmation. The deed is registered under Redwood Holdings, and I'm the sole member." Her denial morphed into desperate accusation. She realized the claim might be true, so she needed to reframe it as something sinister. "You stalked them," she said, pointing at our parents. "You found out they had to sell the house, and you bought this building just to trap them. You set this up to humiliate them. What kind of sick person forces their own parents to pay them rent?" Her logic was frantic and full of holes, but it was her only defense. She needed to cast me as a villain to preserve our father's image as a victim. I shut her down with facts. "I purchased this property 3 years before Dad took early retirement," I explained, keeping my voice conversational. "I didn't recruit them as tenants. They submitted a standard application through Summit's screening process. The system doesn't flag family relations. The application was routed to my approval queue because this is a premium unit. I recognized the names. I had 3 choices. I could reject the application and force them into a less desirable neighborhood. I could approve it with a family discount, or I could let the system process it normally. I chose neutrality. They signed a standard 12-month lease. They pay market rate. I've never intervened in their tenancy." The clinical indifference hit Melissa harder than any insult could have. She wanted drama. She wanted to believe I harbored deep obsessive hatred. The reality that I viewed them as nothing more than data points on a spreadsheet, generic entries generating predictable monthly yield, was an ego death she couldn't process. "You're sick," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You let him sit there and humiliate you while you're taking his money." I looked at her calmly. "He chose how to speak to me, Melissa. I only chose where to deposit the rent check." The extended family began their retreat. Cousin Rachel pushed her chair back slowly, the scraping sound deafening. "I think we should probably get going," she muttered, avoiding everyone's eyes and grabbing her coat. Uncle Tom agreed immediately, standing so fast he nearly knocked over his water glass. The exodus began. Relatives who had sat silently while my father abused me now scrambled to escape the blast radius of his destruction. They mumbled awkward excuses about long drives and early mornings, shuffling toward the door in a disorganized panic. They recognized the family structure was imploding, and they wanted to be gone before the roof caved in. I remained seated, watching the frantic departure with complete detachment. I didn't feel triumph. I felt clean, cold peace. The truth doesn't require defense. It simply exists, waiting for the right moment to expose lies. Within 10 minutes, the apartment had emptied. The only people remaining were my parents, Melissa, Derek, and me. The tension sought a new outlet. Melissa had failed to rally support. Her accusations had only confirmed my ownership. She looked desperately at Derek, seeking an ally. "Derek, tell her she's insane," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Tell them this is disgusting." Derek had remained silent during the entire exchange, drinking bourbon and watching the patriarch crumble. He knew the depths of Melissa's financial deception. He knew their mortgages were suffocating them. He knew the quiet sister had just executed perfect checkmate. He slowly set his glass on the table. The ice clinked against crystal. He didn't look at his wife. He looked directly at me, and a slow, bitter smile formed on his lips. 4 bourbons deep and exhausted by the performance, he decided the show was over. "Tell them the truth, Melissa," he said quietly. He didn't shout. He spoke with heavy, flat exhaustion. "Tell your father about your real portfolio." "Derek, shut up," Melissa hissed. "Don't do this right now, please." He ignored her completely. He was a dam breaking, releasing months of suppressed terror. "She doesn't own 4 properties," he announced to the room. "The bank owns 4 properties. We own a mountain of crushing debt we can't service." My father's head snapped up. The revelation about me had paralyzed him, but this new threat jolted him back to life. "What are you talking about, Derek?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "Melissa is an investor. The market's just soft right now." Derek let out a dry, humorless laugh. "The market isn't the problem, Gregory. The problem is your daughter bought properties she couldn't afford using adjustable-rate mortgages she didn't understand. The rates reset. The short-term rental market collapsed. Vacancy rates are killing us. We're bleeding money every single month, and there's nothing left to stop it." Melissa slammed her hands over her ears. "Stop talking. Stop." Derek kept going. He was delivering an audit, and he intended to finish. 2 of the 4 properties are in pre-foreclosure right now, he stated clearly, making sure everyone heard the terminology. "We haven't made a mortgage payment on the Cherry Creek house in 3 months. The bank has initiated proceedings. The credit lines are maxed. We're completely bankrupt, Gregory. Completely financially destroyed." The air evaporated. The dual revelations created a suffocating vacuum. Less than an hour ago, my father sat at this table, threatening to disinherit me. He'd publicly humiliated me while elevating Melissa as the family success story. He'd tried to banish the daughter who owned 36 debt-free units so he could hand his imaginary legacy to a daughter who was months away from losing everything to foreclosure. The Eugene family narrative had inverted completely. The golden child was bankrupt, the patriarch was a tenant, and the scapegoat owned the shelter, keeping them from the streets. My mother dropped the dish towel she'd been clutching. The fabric hit the floor with a soft sound. She looked at Melissa, her face showing devastation. She'd spent decades enabling my father's cruelty because she believed his vision was infallible. She'd watched him drain equity from their home to fund Melissa's seed capital. Now she understood that money was gone, incinerated by vanity and ignorance. My father stared at Derek, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. He couldn't reconcile the information. He looked at Melissa, searching for a denial, desperate for any explanation that would restore his preferred reality. Melissa couldn't meet his eyes. She collapsed inward, her designer blouse and expensive haircut no longer able to mask the weight of insolvency. The paper castle had burned, and she was sitting in the ashes in front of everyone. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my cardigan. There was nothing left to discuss. The data had been presented. The audit was complete. I walked to the entryway and picked up my coat. I retrieved the sweet potato casserole I'd brought, still warm under its foil covering. I was leaving with exactly what I'd carried in. I turned back to the dining area one last time. My father was still staring at the table. My mother stood in the kitchen doorway looking lost. Melissa had her face buried in her hands. Derek was pouring himself another drink. I stopped at the threshold and addressed my father directly. "Gregory," I said. Using his first name was deliberate, a formal severing of the parental dynamic. He flinched, but slowly raised his head. His eyes were hollow, stripped of arrogance. "I don't require your validation," I stated flatly. "I didn't build my portfolio to impress you. I built it so I would never have to depend on you. Your assessment of my worth has always been mathematically incorrect." He opened his mouth, searching for words that wouldn't come. He wanted to reclaim authority, but he had no leverage left. I shifted my attention to my mother. "You chose your path, Patricia," I said firmly. "You decided long ago whose comfort mattered. You'll have to live with the consequences." I didn't wait for responses. I turned toward the door, pulled it open, and stepped into the hallway. The cool, neutral air of the corridor felt like absolution after the suffocating apartment. I had delivered my assessment and left them to calculate their losses. But I wasn't quite finished. I still needed to establish operational boundaries. I turned back, holding the door open. My father looked up, clearly bracing for an eviction notice. He expected punishment because that's how he'd always governed. I refused to give him that script. "You won't be asked to leave," I said, my voice even and clinical. "Your lease runs through May. The terms remain intact. Your rent won't increase before renewal, and you won't receive a notice to vacate as long as your payments clear on time." Confusion flickered across his face. The lack of vengeance didn't make sense to him. "You'll pay rent on the 1st of every month." I continued. "There's no grace period for family because we're no longer operating as family. You won't call me if the heater malfunctions. You'll submit maintenance requests through Summit's portal, just like the tenant in 2A and the tenant in 3C. They're your point of contact." I paused, letting the boundaries solidify. "You're my tenant, Gregory. You're a signature on a standard residential lease, nothing more." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He'd spent his life demanding special treatment everywhere he went. I'd just reduced him to a generic ledger entry, entirely unremarkable. He gave a single slow nod, acknowledging his surrender. I looked at my mother one more time. "You're welcome to call me in the future, Patricia, but only if you're prepared to speak the truth. Don't call to discuss weather. Don't call with empty apologies about difficult seasons. If you contact me, it will be to acknowledge your role in bringing us here. Until you find that capacity, lose my number." I didn't wait for tears or protests. I stepped fully into the hallway and let the door close behind me with a firm click, sealing them inside their rented reality. I stood in the corridor, breathing clean air that smelled like industrial carpet and neutral cleaning products. For the first time in 36 years, I didn't feel the weight of their judgment. The suffocating cloak of the scapegoat had slipped off my shoulders and remained locked in that apartment. I felt light. I felt free. I walked to the elevator, my footsteps echoing sharply against the floor. Click, click, click. The sound of a woman walking through her own building. I pressed the call button. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I stepped inside and watched the metal doors slide shut, erasing the 4th floor from view. The car descended smoothly. I watched the numbers count down. 4, 3, 2, 1. I crossed the lobby, noting that the decorative plants near the mailboxes needed water. I made a mental note to contact the landscaping service. These were the practical concerns of ownership, keeping me grounded in operations rather than emotions. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the Denver night. The November air was brutally cold, biting at my exposed skin and instantly fogging my breath. The sky above was deep indigo, clear and vast. In the distance, the Rockies stood like dark silhouettes against the horizon. I inhaled deeply, pulling freezing air into my lungs. The cold was sharp and clean, clearing away the scent of overcooked turkey and cheap candles. I walked across the parking lot to my Honda. Frost was already forming on the windshield, glittering under amber streetlights. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was freezing. I placed the casserole on the passenger seat, started the engine, and sat while the heater struggled to life. The The contrast between my unglamorous car and the multi-million-dollar portfolio I commanded wasn't lost on me. Melissa chased aesthetics and ended up bankrupt. I chased mathematics and ended up owning the building. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen. The Summit dashboard was still active, showing the complete rent roll. I minimized it and opened my contacts. I scrolled to the emergency dispatch number for my property management team and placed the call. It rang twice before someone answered with a professional greeting. "This is Olivia Mitchell," I said clearly, "owner of Redwood Holdings. I'm authorizing a repair order for the downtown building. The lobby door is sticking in cold weather. Please dispatch a technician to adjust the hinges first thing tomorrow morning." The dispatcher confirmed the work order and thanked me. I ended the call. It was routine administrative business, a minor adjustment to a physical asset. But executing that command from my freezing car sealed my detachment. I wasn't a disappointing daughter anymore. I was an owner maintaining infrastructure, and I was finally ready to drive home. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand something. If you've made it this far in this story, you're part of a very specific community. You're someone who understands that the best revenge isn't loud or dramatic. It's mathematical, it's patient, and it's permanent. I want you to subscribe to this channel right now if you haven't already, because we're building something here. We're building a space for people who were underestimated, overlooked, and written off. People who didn't waste energy proving toxic people wrong. People who just quietly built fortresses so high that judgment can't reach them anymore. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me your story. Have you ever been the disappointment who turned out to be the only one with their life together? I read every single comment, and your stories remind me I'm not alone. Now let me tell you about the aftermath. Because the collapse of a paper castle doesn't happen in one dramatic dinner. It happens slowly, in missed payments and unanswered phone calls, until there's nothing left but ash. The Denver winter thawed into muddy spring, and the harsh truth of Melissa's situation became impossible to hide. The adjustable rate mortgages reset exactly as Derek had warned. The carrying costs exceeded rental income by thousands of dollars monthly. Banks aren't interested in Instagram aesthetics or staged photography. Banks care about one thing: whether you can service debt. By February, notices of default were filed with the county. I saw the public records while reviewing tax information for my own properties. The contemporary farmhouse in Cherry Creek went back to the lender first. The 2 short-term rentals followed within weeks, surrendered to the mathematics of foreclosure. Melissa's digital presence vanished overnight. The photographs of designer interiors and captions about being self-made disappeared from the internet, replaced by silence. She was forced to relocate to a small rental unit on the far edge of Lakewood, miles from the prestige she'd craved. Derek didn't stay to watch the auction. He rented a moving truck on a Tuesday, loaded his belongings, and filed for divorce before the month ended. He recognized the foundation was unsalvageable, and he chose self-preservation over loyalty to someone who'd refused to acknowledge reality until it crushed her. Back in Unit 4B, my parents' life contracted into quiet, fearful routine. Every month without fail, rent cleared on the 1st. The electronic transfer moved like clockwork from my father's dwindling accounts to Summit, then to my business ledger. He paid for shelter with the remnants of his pride, knowing the owner didn't grant grace periods or family favors. Fear is effective motivation for a man who's lost everything else. I encountered my father exactly once during those months. It was late March. I was conducting a routine inspection of the building's HVAC system. After confirming everything was functional, I walked through the lobby to check the front entrance alignment. My father was standing by the mailboxes collecting his afternoon delivery. He wore a faded cardigan. His shoulders were visibly rounded, making him look smaller than the man who used to dominate dinner tables. He turned and saw me holding a clipboard, wearing work boots, clearly inspecting the property. The patriarch who once demanded submission froze completely. His eyes darted to my boots, then to the floor. He clutched his mail against his chest, turned sharply, and walked toward the emergency stairwell instead of waiting for the elevator. He couldn't face his landlord. The shame had severed his ability to speak. he had nothing left to say. He preferred climbing 4 flights of stairs to sharing an elevator with the daughter he'd degraded for 36 years. I watched the stairwell door close and returned my attention to the lobby hinges. My mother never called. I'd given her clear parameters. She could only contact me if she intended to speak truth. She lacked the vocabulary for truth, preferring the familiar heat of Unit 4B over the cold accountability of honest conversation. Her absence was just a confirmed data point, nothing more. My own trajectory continued upward, fueled by the discipline my family had mocked. In April, I closed on a 14-unit complex in Wheat Ridge, negotiating directly with a retiring owner who valued clean transactions over public listings. I finalized paperwork in a quiet escrow office, reviewing fixed-rate terms and inspection reports. When the final signature was recorded, I didn't celebrate. I drove to a hardware store, bought heavy-duty locks for the utility rooms, and went directly to secure the new property. My life remains quiet. I still run tax returns for clients. I still eat dinner at my own table. I don't wear designer labels or broadcast my net worth. The wealth isn't for display. The wealth is a moat, a barrier of capital designed to keep chaos far from my peace. Time teaches you the nature of victory. When you spend your youth being measured by rigged standards, you think success means forcing those people to acknowledge you were right. You imagine tearful apologies and reconciliation. That's illusion. Real success isn't about proving toxic people wrong. It's about building walls so high they can never reach you again. You don't owe anyone a seat at your table because you share DNA. You don't owe resources to people who treated your ambition like a joke. You only owe yourself the dignity of a well-built life. I sleep soundly knowing the roof over my head belongs to me, along with 49 other roofs across Denver. I don't care if my name is mentioned at family gatherings because my name is on deeds that will outlast their opinions. The story of the Mitchell family is a mirror. It asks what you're actually building. Are you cultivating character and resilience or collecting addresses to feed vanity? True success isn't proving people wrong. It's constructing a fortress of peace, so impenetrable their judgment becomes irrelevant background noise. My father believed arrogance was armor. He thought corporate titles made him untouchable. He assumed my silence meant acceptance. He didn't know I was building in darkness, constructing something he couldn't see until it owned the ground beneath his feet. When the winds came and illusions fell away, only one thing remained standing. The fortress I built alone, in silence, with nobody's permission. If you've ever had to walk away from a table where you were served nothing but disrespect, you made the right choice. If you've ever had to build your own table in the dark, you're not the disappointment. You're the architect. Keep building your fortress. Keep collecting peace. And remember, the quietest people in the room are often the most dangerous because we're not making noise, we're making moves. Thank you for being here. Subscribe if you believe in the power of silence and strategy. Comment with your story, and I'll see you in the next one.